GregAthon Fields, the American macro machine, returns for Gregathon, the series in which I take a look back at every GSL game GregAthon Fields ever played, at least the ones that have VODs or replays available. This time we have a contentious, memorable match against oGsZenio, a player that would later go on to be on Team Liquid, and even considered a bit of a rival for IdrA, and very oddly, on his way to playing IdrA here in the round of 16, Zenio went through two future champion, GSL champion Terran players. MVP, who of course was god tier in Wings of Liberty but didn't really hit his stride until the third GSL, sort of like how Nestea didn't hit his stride till the second GSL, and even halfway through this GSL, Tasteless and Artosis really weren't high on Nestea because in the first season he looked sort of bad. But it's just interesting to note the perception of players at the time, because everyone thinks about Tasteless and Artosis loving Nestea and Nestea being a meme. Well, back in this time, even whenever Nestea was electric and went on to the finals of this very GSL, Tasteless and Artosis weren't super high on Nestea. It took a while for him to build that reputation, so you always have to remember that when it comes to players, especially in this early time. It was hard to distinguish MVP from just your sort of coin-flipping Terran player like a Hyperdub. So many Terran players were in GSL and were able to go for aggressive options. There was a little bit of mystery as to which ones actually had the talent to go on and continue and were going to be there for the long haul, because a ton of these guys just fizzled out and were never heard from again. Long before the Kespa switch. We're talking names like Ensnare and Hyperdub. A lot of these guys looked very scary in the first couple GSLs and then just completely fucking disappeared. But let's get into the game here on Delta Quadrant, a map that has backdoor rocks on your natural, which is a pocket base. Now this was a very common theme in the early days of StarCraft 2. If ever there was a relatively easy natural or third base to take, for whatever reason, even though the maps were still insanely small and bad for Zerg, Blizzard would say, well, fuck it, let's put some rocks on there. And the reason that rocks are uniquely bad for Zerg, if you haven't been watching the Venomous Classic series, is because Zerg makes all of their stuff from the hatchery, whereas Terran and Protoss have barracks and robos and gateways, stuff that is independent from their worker producing facility. Therefore, Terran and Protoss, as long as they're pumping workers in their two bases, they're not going to lose any economy if they make attacking units, whereas Zerg, anytime they make an attacking unit, they have to sacrifice a drone. And Zerg wants to be making straight up drones in the early and mid game, and macro Zergs want to be making pretty much drones all the way up to between like 60 and 80. That's the Zerg paradise, is you don't have to worry or make any attacking units. You can just get a huge economy, a lot of creep spread, and map control. But we're not going to be seeing a ton of bases in this. This is 2010 era Zerg versus Zerg, round of 16 of the Season 2 2010 GSL. Both players are going to go for Roach openers probably. That was the standard meta. And that was because so many of the naturals were hard to defend, for the same reasons they were hard to defend against Protoss and Terran, whether they be just openness, like a Xel'Naga Caverns, or close rush distance, or a mix of both. You put yourself in this position where you can't really hatchery down on the low ground, or you're just going to die to so many different builds. Remember, when you start with so few workers, you put yourself in a position where you have to make conscious decisions to get all the way up to like 15, say, drones, which was the standard number you would make a hatchery on. Whereas, think about now, you start with 14 workers. You know, you don't have to make so many conscious decisions. Even if you want to go hatchery first, you're only making like 3 workers, 4 workers in an Overlord. Whereas in this era, you know, it was 3 or 4 workers, Overlord, and then 3 or 4 more, probably even 5 or 6. And then a hatch. Meanwhile, your opponent, they could 6 pull, they could 9 pull, they could 10 pull speed, they could 10 pull drone pull. There were just way more aggressive options, and when you make a tiny ass little map, the more dim-witted the aggressive option is, the more lethal it is. And Zerg is getting a scout here, that is IdrA, the red Zerg. He's in the top left, Zenio is in the bottom left. So IdrA knows what Zenio's doing, but it's about what he expects and what IdrA himself is doing. Now Artosis, who played Macro Zerg at the time, was talking about how he gave IdrA a strategy, and IdrA was actually doing it in this game, which is that you get a quick 7 roaches out as IdrA denies the scout there, which is nice, and he's pushing creep out to the top of his ramp with the second queen. The idea here is that you rush out roaches to open up your natural rocks. You get a spine for the high ground, and then once you break the rocks or once you see pressure coming, you just camp the roaches at the top of the ramp. Because think about the maps at the time, not many of them had these super tight ramps that you could camp at the top at. Why do you think it's so difficult for Zerg to go hatch first, let's say on that low ground? Because there's no ramp, there's no high ground, there's no real choke, it's just fucking open. So you can really get abused with Ling Bane, especially if your opponent has the build order advantage and went 10-10 and get speed and Bane Nest before you. You're not really going to be able to walk all the way down and defend that. So this is why we see roach-centric strategies that block the ramp. Now that the players are sort of careening into the mid-game, we see a couple Overseers made. And Overseers, for a hot minute, the Contaminate spell, which delays research, was significantly less energy. I want to say it was like 55, now it's like 150. It's pretty much never used now. It probably needs to be buffed back to like 100 energy or some shit. But it was 75 energy. But there was this weird little ZVZ strategy at the time that was sort of cheesy, that really wasn't even considered that good, where one of the players would make a couple Overseers, and the Overseers would contaminate the hatchery. And the idea here is that a contaminated hatchery can't be injected. And notice IdrA already has lair, so the Overseers got there before after the lair finished. It would have sucked if the lair was 90% done, got contaminated, and the research got delayed, because then that would have delayed roach speed and whatnot. But we can see here that yellow, bottom left, Zenio over here, really delayed a lot of stuff to rush out these Overseers, and this is a Overseer-centric strategy, and IdrA's trying to go into Hydra here, but it's very hard because if you can never inject your hatch, obviously the other player is going to have a larva advantage on you, and IdrA's sort of having to try to defend with the queen, and queens had way worse anti-air range than they did in the future. Like now, or even 3 years ago, the queen was just a way worse defensive unit overall. It was even worse on the ground. It was a really shitty unit, and the queen getting buffed in 2012 is a big reason why we saw Zerg improve. But Zenio's going to test the ramp here, as IdrA had a couple roaches out in the incorrect position, and the spine is going to try to put in work. Zenio will move past it. Drones are having to be pulled here, and notice how incredibly fast Zenio's attack hit once he left. IdrA will just barely clean up this assault because he has defender's advantage, but he lost quite a few drones there, and I think Zenio thought, well, he's going to try to be making drones, he is delayed, and his injects are going to be delayed, and I'm going to have more roaches than him, I'll just Rambo up there, and IdrA wasn't exactly standing on top of the ramp in hold position, which the spine crawler is sort of in a I'm just going to stand at the top and be more safe spot. Whereas a lot of people you would think, well, wouldn't you want to have it at the very, very corner of the ramp so that you can get more shots off? Well, Zenio, a lot of players would have an Overlord for vision there and would just be able to snipe it from the low ground. So IdrA has it in a position where Zenio has to commit up the ramp to attack. And remember, IdrA thinks Zenio's on one base. I have more larvae than him. I'll be able to outproduce him even with this Overseer cheese. Notice that both players are on low drone counts, probably like 24 drones each, so they're not going to be able to make a shitload of roaches. This is a very down and dirty, scrappy ZVZ. And frequently on this series, the Gregathon, I have pointed out correctly how insanely difficult it was for Zerg players to deal with toss, as we see 22 to 20 drones at freaking 11 minutes. That's Delta Quadrant for you. Very difficult for Zerg to deal with the Protoss and Terran nonsense in this era. However, we forget that one of the most obnoxious things about being a Zerg pro gamer is IdrA doesn't have a queen in his main, and the one he's making is permanently stuck. As you had to play ZVZ, even when you didn't have to play an imbalanced, annoying matchup, you had to play one of the most annoying, volatile, shitty mirrors that came down so much to micro, and a lot of times players would fly and be jet lagged and not be able to micro at the top of their game, and that's how IdrA lost to LiveZerg at some European tournament. LiveZerg, some Russian or Ukrainian guy no one ever heard from after that match, but you're jet lagged. It's easy to lose Ling Bane if you like to do a macro build and your opponent's doing some insane cheese. And Zenio is finally taking his natural. He's getting Burrow, +1, and Roaches. But just look at how close the third bases are. I mean, if we think about it, they sort of can both take the gold. That would be like a base that you would think in a normal map would be like, oh yeah, that could be an acceptable third, as Zenio just continues to goop these hatcheries and prevent IdrA from getting a queen count up or injecting properly. But IdrA finally is getting some Hydras out. But it was funny, Hydras were so slow and clunky, and queens were sort of slower and more clunky and less good in general, that IdRA's really struggling to defend, and the rush distance is so quick. Zenio's going to get way up here, very close, very quickly, and Espine's still at the top of the ramp. But Zenio always testing IdrA. Now he's just going to do a bit of a soft contain, prevent a third base from going down. And notice that Zenio's getting Overlord speed. He wants to continue to do this harass, and we see IdRA's money. He's not floating money despite the constant problems trying to inject, and see both players are just so low on drones. This was such a gritty era. Now we see it's almost like, the Zerg players will get into at least 30 drones even if they're cheesing. Now they're just down each other's throat the entire game. Very scrappy. And what's very interesting is if it's one of those matchups that's so volatile with maps so small that the first person to try to transition or take a third base is seemingly going to lose. We saw this was sort of the meme in PvP for a while. First player to make a forge loses, stuff like this. Frequently on maps this small, it's like if a guy tries to be proper and, okay, I'm finally going to take my third, 17 minutes in. Oh, I'll just make a handful of roaches and A move, and you don't have enough shit because it's Delta Quadrant and your cycle's not even done. We have to really respect for Zerg champions of this era how volatile ZVZ was, and even if the other matchups were bad for Zerg, we have to remember that this matchup was just as annoying, just as volatile, and it really makes you consider how hard it was to be a Zerg champion back then, because now the queen is so good where if you're a consistent strong macro player, pretty much all the maps are cookie cutter. If you're better than your opponent, that's going to show. If you're going to be able to get a third and play a straight up game. Back in this era, half of the freaking fight was figuring out what bullshit your opponent was going to do that could auto kill you, whether it be because there was a cliff above your natural or because they had the ability to surprise you with the quick attack like on this map. And IdRA's moving on the low ground with the spine. It looks like he might be trying to take a third here, folks, and he is. +1 about to finish for IdrA, as well as 8 roaches, but Zenio at his front door. IdRA's in trouble here as Zenio, notice he went very roach heavy, so once IdRA's roaches die, Hydras will be pretty worthless. Zenio did make quite a few Hydras too, and IdrA, it looks like he's going to get broken here, as the defender's advantage doesn't really exist so much when the rush distance is this short, and IdrA is going to get broken here. Zenio hit him at just a little bit of a power trough when he tried to take his third. Zenio had more of a roach-centric mix, more of a ham-handed slam your way in there mix instead of a late game macro mix, and IdrA just got caught completely off guard. And once that attack occurred, he was just completely unable to recover because of the rush distance and the way the matchup worked. And IdrA GG's, and he'll lose to Zenio there, so you want to make sure you subscribe and hit the bell notification icon because the sub boxes on YouTube don't really work.